a dentist, a breakup, and a murder for hire. Everyone said Brenda Delgado killed Kendra Hatcher out of jealousy. She didn't. Investigators found screenshots on Brenda Delgado's phone. Screenshots of a Find My iPhone app tracking her ex-boyfriend's location. A saved image of Dr. Ricardo Paniagua and his new girlfriend, Kendra Hatcher. Frontier Airlines reservation confirmations for their trip to a stored copy of Paniagua's social security card. For months, she'd been reading his emails, accessing his iCloud, and monitoring his bank account. Every one of these digital artifacts Brenda Delgado collected was a self-inflicted injury, not a choice to gather intel, though that's what she told herself, a choice to rub salt in her wounds, to deepen her pain and fuel her anger. Each time Delgado snuck into Paniagua's email, she saw his new life unfolding without her. Each time she checked the tracking app, she confirmed he was somewhere she wasn't. Each screenshot she saved was a photograph of her own rejection, filed away and kept close, a wound she could reopen at will. She did it over and over again. This was not a woman surfing for an old flame out of idle curiosity. This was a carefully curated digital dossier on her ex's new relationship, compulsively assembled by a person who could not stop obsessing over the man she believed she deserved and was determined to keep. That obsession did not stay digital for long. Brenda Delgado asked her cousin to destroy the woman her ex was dating. She asked her roommate. She asked random men on the street. She discussed methods: a baseball bat, an injection in the back of her neck, kidnapping and shooting. She researched silencers. She conducted surveillance with binoculars. She organized dry runs. She recruited a driver, hired a shooter, swapped vehicles, stole a license plate, and staged an alibi at a restaurant, while a 35-year-old pediatric dentist was shot in the back of the head in her own parking garage. Then she called her henchman and asked, "Is the task complete?" The answer was yes. Dr. Kendra Hatcher was dead. The jury deliberated for less than 20 minutes. She was on a different level. Kendra Hatcher grew up in Pleasant Plains, Illinois, with 3 sisters and a brother. Her family raised her with strong Christian values, and she put them into practice. She went on mission trips abroad to help build churches. She led Bible studies for low-income children. In college, at DePaul University, she majored in Spanish. She minored in biochemistry, a combination that speaks to who she was, someone who wanted to connect with people and understand how things work. After graduating from the University of Kentucky College of Dentistry, she moved to Dallas. She took a position at Smile Zone, a dental practice that provided high-end care to children from disadvantaged backgrounds. She spent a semester serving in Spain, and one Christmas, traveled to Ecuador to provide free care to children who had never seen a dentist. She practiced her Spanish so she could talk to the families she served. She was 35 years old and loving life. Her brother, Neil, said she was on a different level when it came to just being awesome, and she had finally found love. Kendra had met Dr. Ricardo Ricky Paniagua through a dating app. He was a dermatologist at UT Southwestern Medical Center. The relationship was only a few months old, but it was serious. Kendra's close friend, Tommy Pantono, said Paniagua had this kindness about him, and that Kendra immediately fell for Ricky and fell hard. They were talking about marriage. They had a trip to Cancun planned for the Labor Day weekend. The evening of September 2nd, 2015, Kendra drove home from work. She pulled into the parking garage of her apartment complex, Gables Park 17, in Uptown Dallas. She didn't know that a black Jeep Cherokee had tailgated behind another resident's car and was waiting for her. She didn't know that Christopher Love, the man in the back seat, had a Smith & Wesson handgun. She didn't know that a woman she had never met had spent months planning this moment. He ran up to her car and ordered her to get down on the ground. Kendra screamed. Crystal Cortius, the driver, heard it from behind the wheel of the Jeep. "Help, help, help me." And then the shots. The shooter ran back to the vehicle, carrying Kendra's purse, her camera, and the gun. Cortez drove out of the garage. Within minutes, Delgado knew her mission had been accomplished. Now, she thought, he won't move back to California. I'll be there for him while he grieves. Ricky will come back to me. The woman who disappeared into a relationship, Brenda Delgado and Ricardo Paniagua were together for nearly 3 years. They went through a lot. At one point during the relationship, Delgado became pregnant. After the two discussed it, she had an abortion. That decision, whatever its emotional weight, did not end the relationship. The breakup came in February 2015, when Paniagua ended things. Friends and family described a woman who revolved around Ricardo Paniagua. She talked about him constantly. She introduced herself in relation to him, his girlfriend, his partner. She seemed to align her self-worth with Ricky's accomplishments as an attractive, socially polished doctor. It was as if she basked in his sun. Brenda's psychological dependence on Ricky had mushroomed enough that her friends began to notice and remember. This identity fusion collapses the boundary between self and relationship, so that who I am becomes inseparable from who I am with. It is not the same as being in love. People in love maintain a sense of themselves as separate individuals who have chosen to be together. For a person with a strong sense of self and self-worth, a breakup is still devastating. It hurts. You grieve, but you survive. You still have a career, friendships, interests, and a sense of who you are apart from the person who left. Identity fusion is different. Who you are becomes the relationship. And when it ends, the self has nowhere to go. Research shows that individuals who deeply internalize a romantic partner into their self-concept experience not only lose the relationship during a breakup, but they also lose their sense of who they are. For a person whose identity has fused with the relationship, the breakup isn't just a loss. It is the collapse of the self. There is no stable ground left to grieve from. The behavioral evidence suggests that this is what happened to Delgado. After the breakup, Brenda couldn't redirect. She didn't grieve and move forward. She stalked. Ricky had no idea that his ex had accessed his phone and computer passwords when they were dating. Outwardly, Brenda kept the relationship alive by any means possible. She hid her hurt and acted as if the breakup was mutual. She pretended to be platonic friends. She acted surprised when she ran into Ricky at places where she knew he would be. When, in June, Paniagua emailed Brenda about his new relationship, she wished him well. Delgado kept stalking. Every click a fresh wound. Brenda was a woman on a mission. She tracked Ricky's phone location through Find My iPhone. She read his emails. She accessed his iPhone. She screenshotted his travel plans. She saved an image of him with Kendra. She retained a copy of his social security card. Her friend Jennifer Escobar later testified that Delgado would show her how she tracked Paniagua's location and read his emails, not out of embarrassment or shame, but almost as a demonstration of her control. Look what I can see. Look how close I still am. Every time Delgado opened Paniagua's email account, she read love messages that weren't for her. Every time she checked his location, she watched him go places without her. A saved screenshot of his Cancun reservations was a reminder of a vacation he was planning with someone else. This was psychological not in the clinical sense of deliberate physical injury, but in the structural sense, obsessive, repetitive behavior that the person knows, at some level, is causing them pain, but they continue to do behavior that, at the time, they don't feel able to stop doing. The clinical term for this is rumination, and Brenda Delgado certainly isn't the first person to be caught in its trap. Rumination is a maladaptive coping style, a repetitive, passive focus on the symptoms and causes of one's distress, without progressing to active coping or problem solving. The person mentally replays the same scenario, the same injury, the same unanswerable question, over and over, and each cycle deepens the emotional wound rather than healing it. The research on the effects of rumination on people is extensive and grim. It heightens vulnerability to depression, anxiety, and insomnia. It fuels impulsive behavior. It activates the body's chronic stress response. It has been linked to binge drinking, disordered eating, and self-injurious behavior. Longitudinal studies have found that people who frequently ruminate are at greater risk of prolonged depressive episodes, and that this pattern can persist for years if the cycle is not interrupted. It seldom, however, leads to murder. Stressful life events involving social rejection are among the most potent triggers for ruminative spirals, Slavich and colleagues proposed a psychobiological model of depression, in which social rejection activates neurobiological stress pathways, inflammatory responses, cortisol dysregulation, and heightened self-referential processing that make individuals more vulnerable to the kind of repetitive, self-focused thinking that characterizes rumination. The brain treats romantic rejection as a threat, and in vulnerable individuals, the threat response never fully resolves. It loops. Delgado's phone was the replay mechanism. It was the tool she used to keep the wound open. Delgado could access Paniaga's emails, read his texts, track his movements, and review his travel plans, all from bed, at 3 in the morning, as many times as she wanted. Technology didn't create her obsession, but it gave the obsession an infinite food supply. On August 26, 2015, 1 week before the murder, Brenda graduated from a dental hygienist program at Sanford Brown College. Her family came to the ceremony. They gave her flowers and took her to dinner. She posed for smiling selfies with her classmates. Her brother later said she seemed perfectly happy, that she was looking to the future. The completion of her own professional goal, something that could have redirected her energy, given her an identity outside the relationship, and provided something to build on, changed nothing. She was already deep into planning the murder of a woman she had never met. The obsession was already running the show. By the time she walked across that graduation stage, the surveillance had been going on for months, and the murder plot was in motion. Brenda was building a future and dismantling someone else's at the same time. Jealousy is not what killed Kendra Hatcher. This case has often been called a jealousy murder from the beginning. Prosecutors used the term. So did the media. But I think jealousy is the wrong word. Jealousy is the fear of losing something you have. It's the pang you feel when your partner talks too long to someone attractive at a party. It's possessive and anxious, but its emotional core is threat. I have this and I might lose it. Jealousy is protective. It clings. Envy is different. Envy is wanting what someone else has. And in its most destructive form, envy doesn't just want what the other person possesses. It wants to destroy it. If I can't have it, neither can you. Envy doesn't cling. It demands. By the time Delgado began planning Kendra Hatcher's death, they had been broken up for months. There was nothing left to be jealous of. What Delgado was experiencing was envy, the corrosive, consuming awareness that someone else had the things she wanted and could not get back. Kendra Hatcher had Paniaga's love, his time, his travel plans, his future. She had met his parents. She was going to but the envy went deeper than the loss of a lover. Kendra Hatcher represented everything Brenda Delgado wanted and couldn't have. Brenda had dreamed of being a doctor, but couldn't afford it. Kendra had a dental degree from the University of Kentucky. Kendra was a pediatric dentist running a practice. Brenda had just become a dental hygienist, technically in the same professional ecosystem, but in a subordinate role. Kendra had financial independence. Brenda had worked multiple jobs her entire adult life. Kendra had a career built around service, respect, and professional achievement. Brenda had a life she felt fell short of her dreams. For Brenda, it wasn't "he left me for someone else." In her mind, it was "he left me for someone better." And when better is defined across every dimension you care about, romance, career, education, status, the rival was a symbol, a daily breathing screenshotted reminder that Brenda Delgado was not enough. She just wanted to eliminate Kendra Hatcher. Brenda Delgado did not want to get her hands dirty, nor did she want to get caught. At trial, her cousin, Moses Martinez, testified that Delgado asked him to hit Kendra Hatcher with a baseball bat. She showed him the bat. She offered to pay him. Martinez initially told the jury she'd said she wanted to scare Hatcher, but when shown a transcript of what he'd told police, he acknowledged she'd wanted him to hit her. Her friend and roommate, Jennifer Escobar, testified that Delgado offered her $2,000, drugs, and a car to put Ricky in a coma and kill Hatcher. The method Delgado proposed for Hatcher, an injection needle to the back of the neck. Escobar admitted she was addicted to drugs at the time. Both refused. Neither went to the police. Brenda's persistence is psychologically significant. When someone asks one person to commit violence and is refused, you might call it an intrusive thought spoken aloud. a moment of desperation that shame quickly when someone asks for 2 or 3 and then keeps looking for a 4th, it is no longer a thought or a fantasy. It is a project. I imagine each request was also a test. Delgado was gauging who in her circle was persuadable, who was desperate enough, loyal enough, or morally flexible enough to say yes. That requires a read on other people's vulnerabilities and a willingness to exploit them. Crystal Cortez said yes. The bridge, the trigger, and the wheel. Every murder for hire plot has a structure. There is the person who wants the killing done. There is the person who does it. And very often, there is someone in between, a bridge who connects the two worlds. In this case, the bridge was Crystal Cortez. Cortez was a single mother from an impoverished background. She was 23 years old, broke, and trying to support a young son. She met Delgado through Brenda's short-term roommate, the one Brenda had already tried to recruit, who moved out shortly afterward. Crystal later testified that she looked up to Delgado, who had taken her out to a couple of fancy dinners, and seemingly taken an interest in her. It's an economic and social dynamic that made recruitment easier. Delgado was not offering a transaction between equals. She was the higher status figure, older, more established, connected. Cortez wanted her approval. She needed money. That asymmetry is often how manipulation works in practice. Someone you admire asking for something that at first feels like trust. Cortez testified that approximately 2 weeks after meeting Delgado, they began planning the murder. That timeline is fast enough to suggest that Delgado's recruitment strategy was efficient, and Cortez was open to it. Research shows that criminal participation is often incremental. The first conversation isn't "will you help me kill someone?" It's softer. It's "she doesn't deserve him, then someone should teach her a lesson. Then what if someone handled it?" Each step reduces psychological resistance by a small amount. By the time the explicit ask arrives, the person has already been primed to say yes. Christopher Love, a small-time marijuana dealer with career aspirations of starting his own prostitution ring and enhancing his status as a drug dealer, accepted the role of hitman. He was brought into the plot through Court's network. He said it would be easiest to use a gun, so they settled on shooting, staged as a robbery gone bad. They met more than a dozen times to plan. Cortez helped locate the murder weapon. For 2 weeks, she and Delgado took turns following Kendra home from work to map her daily routine. They used binoculars to watch her at her dental office. They conducted a dry run the day before, timing the drive from Love's apartment to Hatcher's work, and then to her building. They stole a temporary paper license plate for the Jeep. They assembled gloves, cleaning supplies, and disinfectant wipes. The payments? $500 for Cortez drugs, and cash totaling roughly $3,000 for Love. Delgado promised to use her cartel connections, which were non-existent, to help Love improve his criminal status. The low price for such a heinous act often shocks jurors, but it's not uncommon in murder for hire cases. The intensity of the motive is enormous, but the transaction value is trivial. This was not a professional contract killing. It was a personal vendetta cheaply outsourced. The psychology of the driver. Crystal Cortez had met Brenda Delgado only weeks before the murder. She drove the car. She was later the prosecution's star witness. How a young woman with no apparent history of violence became the getaway driver in a premeditated execution is more complicated than the trial record shows. By the time the explicit proposal arrived, Cortez had spent 2 weeks listening to Delgado's grievance and anger. The early conversations would not have sounded like a criminal conspiracy. They would have sounded like friendship, like being let in. At trial, she described the planning in flat procedural terms. The dry runs, the binoculars, the license plate, the routes. She did not describe emotional turmoil or a moral dilemma at the time. She knew what was being planned. She participated in the planning, and she arranged $500 in a heart shape and posed for a selfie with Delgado after it was done. That selfie gets read as evidence of callousness, and perhaps it is. But it is also consistent with what happens when framing has been successful. The murder had been called a task for weeks. The task was complete. The selfie was the celebration of a completed task. not a murder. Moral disengagement is effective because it doesn't register as disengagement. By that point, it just feels like success. But Cortez made a choice that Martinez and Escobar had refused to make. She said yes. Whether that was desperation, admiration, manipulation, or some combination that even she could not fully articulate, she chose participation over refusal. That choice put her behind the wheel on September 2nd. It also eventually put her on the witness stand. She will be in prison until she is at least in her mid-40s. The heart-shaped cache and the selfie will follow her there. September 2nd, 2015. Kendra Hatcher went to work that morning. She cleaned children's teeth. She was one shift away from a Labor Day vacation in Cancun with the man she was in love with. On the other side of Dallas, Delgado, Cortez, and Love were coordinating vehicle logistics, swapping cars to use a borrowed black Jeep Cherokee instead of a less reliable BMW. Delgado positioned herself at a restaurant in Carrollton to establish an alibi, while Cortez and Love drove to Hatcher's neighborhood. The Cancun trip was the accelerant. Delgado had screenshotted the Frontier Airlines reservation on Pontiaga's account. They were flying out the next morning. To Brenda, this was a deadline. That afternoon, Cortez and Love checked whether Hatcher's dental office was still open. They attempted to follow her when she left work, but lost her in traffic. They raced to the Gables Park 17 apartment complex and tailgated in through the garage gate behind a resident's vehicle. They waited. Then they killed her with a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. Upstairs in the apartment, Ricky Pontiaga waited for Kendra to come home. At some point, he stepped out to get tacos. When he returned to Gables Park 17, the parking garage was sealed, and police were everywhere. A lobby employee told him what had happened. Kendra Hatcher's body was still in the parking garage. How robbery became hit. The robbery staging unraveled quickly. The sophistication of the approach, tailgating into a secured garage, lying in wait. Execution-style shot to the back of the head, did not match the disorganized, opportunistic pattern of a genuine, actual robbery gone wrong. The crime scene told a story that contradicted the narrative it was supposed to tell. The break came from the Jeep. Dallas police released surveillance stills of the vehicle and the female driver to the media. Jose Luis Ortiz, the owner of the Jeep, recognized it and contacted the police. He said he had loaned the car to his friend Brenda Delgado and had no idea how it had been involved in a murder. Detective Eric Barnes interviewed Delgado on September 4th. She came in voluntarily and brought an alibi, a restaurant receipt, pristine and unwrinkled, as if it had been preserved in anticipation of exactly this conversation. Barnes later testified that Delgado appeared prepared for the interrogation, but the police didn't have enough evidence to arrest her. Barnes's interrogation strategy was revealing. He tried to connect with Delgado emotionally. "I understand wanting something that you can't have," he told her. Then, more directly, "I think you hated it that you weren't good enough." Hate, he accused, drove her to plan the murder. Meanwhile, the digital evidence was building. Cell tower data placed Cortez's and Love's phones near Hatcher's apartment on the day of the murder. Inactivity windows, periods where phones went dark during the critical time frame, suggested deliberate shutdowns. Post-event searches for news coverage of the murder appeared on their devices. Text messages, referencing Kush, as expected payments surfaced. And Delgado's phone yielded the obsession dossier. The tracking screenshots, the saved images, the airline reservations, the social security card. Digital evidence has a particular power in cases like this. It captures cognitive states, what someone was thinking about, and when with a precision that witness testimony cannot match. Delgado's phone didn't just prove surveillance. It proved that her entire mental life had narrowed to a single fixation. Delgado was brought in for a second interview and then, briefly, arrested on an unrelated traffic warrant. She made bail on September 5th and was gone within hours. She crossed the border into Mexico, disappearing for months. Cortez and Love were arrested separately. Cortez initially did not cooperate. Her first account to investigators was that she had driven Love to the garage, believing he intended to commit a robbery, not a murder. That story did not hold. The cell data, the surveillance footage, the text messages, the cleaning supplies, The stolen license plate, the binoculars, the dry runs, the physical and digital record of the plot was too dense. At some point, Cortez calculated that cooperation was her only viable path. What she gave prosecutors in exchange for her own plea deal was, in practical terms, the case. She had been in the planning conversations. She had received the payment. She had been behind the wheel. Without Cortez on the stand, the prosecution could have proved the conspiracy through digital evidence, but would have had a harder time placing Delgado at its center. Cortez provided the human architecture. The cell towers proved she was there. Cortez explained why. The 506th fugitive. On October 7, 2015, a federal warrant for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution was issued for Brenda Delgado. On April 6, 2016, she was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, the 506th person ever placed there, and only the 9th woman. A $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to her capture. 2 days later, she was arrested in Torreon, Coahuila, Mexico, in a coordinated operation involving the FBI and Mexican authorities. She was held in Mexico for approximately 6 months before being extradited to Texas on October 6, 2016. Because Mexico does not have a death penalty, the extradition agreement stipulated that Delgado could not be executed even if convicted of capital murder. Her co-defendants received no such protection. Christopher Love was convicted of capital murder in October 2018 and sentenced to death. Crystal Cortez, who cooperated with prosecutors and testified against both Love and Delgado, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 35 years. 20 minutes. Brenda Delgado's capital murder trial began in June 2019, nearly 4 years after Kendra's death. The prosecution presented the case methodically. Cortez's testimony about the planning and execution, corroborated by cell tower data, surveillance footage, phone extractions, and the testimony of other witnesses Delgado had approached. Prosecutors showed the jury the binoculars that Cortez said she and Delgado had used to spy on Hatcher from outside her dental office. They played the interrogation video. They presented the phone extractions that documented months of digital surveillance. They showed the selfie. The jury deliberated for less than 20 minutes. In the victim impact statements that followed, Kendra's mother, Bonnie Jameson, addressed Delgado directly. "You, Brenda Delgado, have earned your spot on this earth behind cold steel bars for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life. And if justice could have handed you a death sentence, make no mistake, I would have been there front and center." Kendra's sister, Ashley Lipscomb, "No matter how envious you were of any human being, it does not give you the right to destroy lives. Envious, not jealous." Kendra's own sister saw it for what it was. Delgado received life without the possibility of parole. She raised 11 issues on appeal. The Texas 5th District Court of Appeals found no reversible error and affirmed the conviction. The steep price of obsession. In the months before the murder, Delgado had lost Penny. There was no indication he was ever going to come back to Brenda, regardless of what happened to Kendra. He had dated another woman before Kendra. She was finishing dental hygienist school, but the achievement meant nothing to her. Her entire psychological world had narrowed to a single fixation. She had his present, which she accessed through stolen passwords and tracking apps, and which hurt her every time she looked. Every screenshot was a wound she inflicted on herself. Every email she read was a letter meant for someone else. Every location ping confirmed she was not where he was. The surveillance didn't bring her closer to Penny. It confirmed, over and over, the distance between them, and instead of that distance producing the grief that might eventually have led to acceptance, it produced rumination, the obsessive replay loop that deepens injury instead of healing it. I see this pattern in forensic work more often than people might expect, though rarely with consequences this extreme. The ex-partner who can't stop checking social media, the rejected lover who drives past the old apartment, the person who maintains fake accounts to monitor someone who has moved on, to the person performing them. These behaviors feel like they are doing something, like they are maintaining a connection, or gathering information, or staying close. But what they are actually doing is preventing their own recovery. They are choosing fresh injury over the slow, unglamorous work of healing. The monitoring feels compulsive, like scratching an itch that only gets worse the more you scratch. They know, at some level, that what they're doing is making them feel worse. But the uncertainty of not knowing feels even more intolerable than the pain of knowing. So they keep checking. They keep looking. They keep feeding the wound. Obsession doesn't just endanger the target, it consumes the By the time Delgado recruited a hitman, she had already destroyed her own life. She just hadn't finished the paperwork yet. When you give yourself away, the obsession didn't appear from nowhere. It grew in soil that had been prepared for years. Brenda Delgado didn't become fused with Ricardo Paniagua after the breakup. She was fused with him during the relationship. Friends and family noticed it at the time. The way every conversation circled back to him. The way she defined herself through his name. The way her social world had contracted to orbit his. The breakup didn't create identity fusion. It revealed how total it already was, because when the relationship ended, there was nothing left underneath. I have seen this pattern across nearly 3 decades of forensic work, and I've seen it in clinical settings, in friends' relationships, and in the letters people write me after reading this newsletter. It rarely ends in murder, but it frequently ends in devastation because a person who has defined themselves by their relationship has nothing to fall back on when it ends. The warning signs are quiet, and they often look like love. The pattern starts with dependency masquerading as devotion. The person's wants and needs become fused with their significant other. Their sense of worth becomes entirely contingent on the relationship. From the outside, they look like any other inseparable couple. From the inside, and sometimes only visible after the relationship ends, one person has stopped existing as an independent entity. They love deeply, sure. But there's a difference between loving someone deeply and needing them to define who you are and how much you're worth. Friendships go dormant, goals get shelved, hobbies, routines, the things that anchored the person before this relationship. They quietly atrophy because the relationship fills every space they used to occupy. I have sat across from people in evaluations who cannot name a single friend they maintained during a relationship that lasted 3, 5, or 10 years. They weren't isolated by their partner. They just stopped building anything outside the relationship, because the relationship felt like enough. Every one of those abandoned friendships, every shelved ambition, every lapsed interest was a load-bearing wall they removed from their own psychological structure. The relationship held them up, and when it ended, there was nothing left to hold them up. Then there's what I think of as the identity label. The person starts defining themselves in relation to their partner, his girlfriend, her husband, their other half. That label starts to feel more real than their own name. I think of a person's identity as a house with many rooms. Career is a room. Friendships are a room. Interests, values, history, plans, all rooms. A romantic relationship is one room, and it can be the most beautiful room in the house. But when it becomes the only room, the person isn't living in a house anymore. They're living in a cage with nice furniture. A person going through the motions of building a life, while their entire inner world orbits around someone who is no longer part of it. That is not rare. I see it in people who will never commit a crime. They show up to work, meet their deadlines, and look fine on the outside. But they have quietly stopped investing in their own future, because the relationship was the only thing that made any of it feel real. The vast majority of people who experience trauma after a breakup respond with depression, withdrawal, or prolonged grief, not violence. The choices Delgado made required something far beyond identity fusion. It required the capacity for instrumental aggression, moral disengagement, and the willingness to treat another human being as an obstacle to be removed. Those are not common traits, and their presence is what separates a painful breakup from a murder for. But the foundation, the giving away of self until there is no self left, is common. And the people most at risk rarely recognize what is happening when they're in the middle of it. It feels like love. It feels like commitment. It feels like the relationship is going so well that nothing else is necessary. In my experience, something else is always necessary, because relationships end, and the person you are when that happens is the person you built while the relationship was still standing. I can't feel much empathy for Delgado's choices, only her pain. Self-harm is pitiable when it turns inward, when it turns outward, when it becomes the engine that drives someone to kill someone else. It becomes something else entirely. Kendra Hatcher spent her last conscious moments screaming for help in a parking garage. She had done nothing to Brenda Delgado. She didn't even know Brenda Delgado existed. That asymmetry is what makes this case so haunting. The obsessor knew everything about her targets, her workplace, her apartment, her daily routine, her travel plans, and her face. The target knew nothing about her killer. One woman had organized her entire life around the other. The other was living. Kendra Hatcher was not just someone Brenda Delgado's ex-boyfriend dated. She was the specific woman who, in every dimension, Delgado measured herself against: education, career, status, romantic worth, came out ahead. She was the mirror Delgado could not stop looking into. And what she saw reflected back was everything she believed she was not. That is not love. It is not even jealousy. It is envy so total that it could not tolerate the existence of the person who provoked it. The bottom line: Delgado is serving life without parole. Love is on death row. Cortez will be in prison for 35 years. Ricky Peniaga came home with tacos and found police lights. Kendra Hatcher's family grieves her absence every day. It would be satisfying to end this with a clean line about obsession, technology, or jealousy. But none of these murdered Kendra Hatcher. What killed her was the collision of specific psychological conditions inside one person. An identity so fused with a relationship that its ending felt like annihilation. An envy so total it could not coexist with the woman who provoked it. And, crucially, the callousness to convert that pain into a plan. Recruit the people to execute it, and call afterward to confirm it was done. Most people who lose themselves in a relationship suffer quietly. Most people who feel envy do not act on it. What makes this case worth studying is not the obsession alone, or the envy alone, or the capacity for organized violence alone. It is that all three existed in the same person, at the same time, pointed at the same target.